So when Jason gave his talk on MIDI and he gave a follow-up talk where he wanted to do it functionally, I questioned whether or not it was functional because he had a variable outside the lexical scope of the function. So I decided I would try and do the project in a purely functional fashion and see how I could make do with it in Ruby. So I decided, it's possible that you could have several messages. So I created the first function, MIDI message, which takes some kind of a message, possibly, and it runs a helper function called MIDI on the message, and then it flattens the result in case there are several messages. This will then stack them together. So the logic of the idea was that if you have a message in MIDI, it starts with a particular character. It starts with a 0xF0, and then anything up to a corresponding 0xF7 in the list would be the contents between them would be the actual message. So I wrote a very straightforward program in an attempt to do a simple do loop on this, and did it through the message.length -1, starting at, so getting the elements starting at 0 because arrays in Ruby start, the first element is the array bracket 0. So I checked to see if the message part I is equal to the start number, the 0xF0. Then I would return, using an accumulator, I would then calculate the end message after dropping off the elements up to that point. Then I go ahead and create the second helper function, which is called end message. It determines what comes after that 0xF0 to determine if it ends in 0xF7 and therefore actually qualifies as a message. And then through some additional iterations of the logic, it turns out I made some errors in logic, which we'll see when we give an example. So I was then forced to, instead of just returning the accumulator, I had to return either the accumulator or an empty list in case the accumulator somehow became nil. In the case that I made a logic error in my program, the accumulator or the empty list would then at least return a value that's not nil in those cases. Right. So similarly for the end message, I did the corresponding thing where I then check to see if the 0xF7 is an element in the list. And then I return the accumulator. I have a second accumulator in this function. But this, what I was doing here is I was keeping all of the variables lexically within the scope of their functions. There's no outside state to work on. So my goal was to write it in a purely functional fashion. So I simply accumulate it, and then I check to see if there's anything else with this other temp variable to see if there's a second message. So that's how I go through the thing and determine if there's more than one message. This is where my logic took a fail somewhere, because what happens when we actually run it, I'll just run it in IRB, and we'll see the consequence of running the application. So we go ahead and run the MIDI message on the first example at the top there. Between 0xF0 and 0xF7, there is a message, 863, so it works correctly in that case. In the second case, I just checked to see if there's an end message. For this particular item, I was trying to test that separately. There's actually the first part of the message that would be passed to end message is the 1242 before the 0xF7. And then there's some noise, which is the 134. And there's actually a second message starting with the 0xF0 and then here with the 0xF7. And there's some additional noise at the end. So you see when I run it, I get a list of lists, but one of the elements is nil, indicating I've not got my logic correct. I then tested it, on some other things. I ended up with nils at various points in there, indicating a failure in my logic. And at the last one, where I check a MIDI message where there isn't even a message, it just starts at 0xF0, but it doesn't terminate with the 0xF7, I actually got a nil coming out of the result. And then when you try and run flatten on that, that of course gives an error because nil can't be flattened. So this was just my attempt to think about the program in a more functional fashion without introducing any class or state variables, to see if there's a simple way to do it. The answer is not as simple as I thought it was. Okay. What I originally anticipated, for example, with my background in Lisp, is that there would be a simple thing like apply sharp sign quote append to a list of lists. That essentially is what flat is intended to do in my application. But in Ruby, it doesn't operate quite the same way. So I've still got to learn some more of the details about how to get that worked out. Does anybody have any questions or comments on the concept? Go ahead.
It seems like you're not writing your code in an idiomatic Ruby way.
Yeah, well, I didn't do, like dot each or anything like that.
Yeah.
I was trying to make, even though the code quality isn't as good, I was trying to make it as straightforward as possible so I could attempt to determine if I have any logic errors.
Yeah. So something like
doing
this.
something simpler.
Can you go to the part where you're iterating over the string?
Okay, the first one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Like where you're using for, and then that whole thing could be quite simplified, I think.
Yeah, so idiomatically you would go ahead and say something like message dot bytes.
Message dot each node, it's
Not
not
each, right.
Yeah. I don't know. Just
Yeah, you're right. I mean, idiomatically can be improved further. The return down here where it says return ACC or on the empty list, that's actually refactored originally from some original code, which said, if ACC equals nil, in an attempt to catch that case. But I decided that, that could be improved by refactoring to just calculate an ACC or empty list.
Yeah, that thing with the ACC or empty,
Yep.
there are two forms of for, and really one is
The
OR
ampersand,
and the
ampersand.
other is the double text symbol.
Yeah.
And can somebody remind us of what the difference is?
They have different
Whether that's correct,
Yeah, operator precedence.
Yeah, it's precedence. The two pipes
yeah.
has higher precedence. So where you run into it is if you're doing assignment, you can sometimes assign things that you don't think you're assigning if you're using the word or. It's where it usually bites you the most.
So here, would you prefer one or the other is okay because the surrounding practices?
You should never use the or that is written out like this. You should always use the pipe.
Well, you can use this or for flow control.
Yeah.
What I would say here, Leon, if you erase your line 7 there.
Okay.
All right, and then on line 12, in your return block, remove the or empty string,
Okay.
the whole thing.
The
And the empty array, yep. Okay. And then to the left of the left parentheses, up against it,
Okay.
right up against it. Capital A array. A-R. Just like that.
That forces it to be an array no
Ah.
matter what.
Okay.
Right, now, you can even take it one step further, and on the right there, put a dot compact. That will remove any nills and leave you with an actual empty array.
Okay.
Now,
See, that's the part
now
that
if
I
you
was-
save and re-IRB that, you should get past that error you're having.
Yeah, unless it's in the second one, which is.
That's possible.
Yes.
Okay.
So the nil is coming out of the second one at the bottom there. But in the one that has the nil there, which is probably just coming out of the second one, so I'd have to redo the array dot compact on that. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to, bring up another way of looking at the problem. Thank you.